First of all, a blessed Sabbath to everyone. And it's a real joy to be with you, to get to know you and your world. Again, as Lauren shared earlier, we've been pals for a long time. Really got to be close in his days when he was in Palo Alto. And we just spent a lot of time hanging out and talking about deep things that relate to what the discussion is today. So thank you, Lauren, for all your leadership of this community over the years, and just celebrate our friendship, ongoing connection. So he also performed our wedding, my wife and I, 30 years ago. Uh, so,
and apparently it worked.
Oh, it stuck. It stuck. 27 years, I should say, of being married. Anyway, a pleasure. So what I would want to do today is just introduce this tradition of progressive Christianity, give some history for it and some background, and have a conversation. Yeah. So what I'll do, I think, is shoot through a slideshow fairly quickly, and then blow it open for conversation. Put up your hands. Lauren will help. Yep. Moderate that part. That would help a great deal.
That's what we do.
Wide open for convo with y'all, questions, comments, perspectives that you have that relate to the subject matter. So let me get going with the slideshow. And away we go. Share. Here we go. So a little background on myself. I'm a ordained United Church of Christ pastor. Went to San Francisco Theological Seminary, where Lauren did a doctorate. I just retired 2 years ago as the Senior Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at the University of Southern California, which was a really fun job. And I just loved it. Every day I learned something new about the world's religions from students who were practicing those faiths. We had thousands of international students, and we had A to Z, atheist to Zoroastrian. And part of the A's were Adventists. And we had a pretty darn cool Adventist group there. I'm trying to remember the name of the pastor. Do you know the guy in LA close to campus, Lauren? Black guy, come on now. Yeah, anyway.
There's several anyway. But you did know Grace Boyd. She works for you.
Yeah, Grace Boyd, a student who worked for our organization last year.
And her cousin Lynn is often on here, Lynn Boyd.
Oh, neat. Cool.
And I don't see him here today yet.
Yeah, neat.
But yeah, did you get to know Todd Leonard at Glendale? He was one of the progressive pastors of that area. And
no,
I think you also got acquainted with our friend Alex Carpenter.
Oh yeah, Alex, for years ago. What a great guy. Yeah, I got to know him early on in my work with progressivechristianity.org. He showed up at events and programs. Did you know, just an aside, just for fun. So I don't know if you know this, Lauren, but Alex went to Burning Man.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that story.
And he his shtick there was to pretend to be a Mormon missionary. This Adventist guy.
That sounds like Alex.
It was pretty far out. Anyway, he's cool. So I had a history of, I worked in churches. I was a community organizer, set up the homeless services agency in Palo Alto. That's when Warren and I got friendly because he was very supportive of what we were doing. So I've had a different, a number of different pieces of my career. But it was when I went to work at Stanford as the Protestant progressive campus minister there. Then I kept encountering these very bright students who would come one at a time, one after another, deconstructing from evangelical Christianity and full of questions. And I would respond, of course, and I would give them lists of books to read, and then they would read them, all of them, within about 2 weeks, and then come back and said, "Okay, that was interesting. Now what?" I'm like, "Whoa, what am I dealing with here?" Very brilliant young people uh, who were getting ahead of me. And I go, "Okay, I need to kind of get my own thoughts together about the Christian faith," and that's when I started writing. So my first book was called Open Christianity, and it was an introduction to progressive Christianity, and very much a response to the questions uh, of my students at Stanford. Uh, that got me started being an activist in the national level progressive Christian world. I went onto the board of progressivechristianity.org, which I commend to you as the hub of all things progressive Christian. Uh, and that group started in the late 1990s. Let me organize here. Well, I'll just go back here. Anyway, progressivechristianity.org got started in the late 1990s. Jim Adams, rector of St. Mark's Episcopal, Washington, D.C., came up with a formulation of what progressive Christianity is. And it was brilliant. And he put it up on a website and he said, "This is progressive Christianity." And when I read that, after having written my book and been out there on the book signing world and all that, I realized, oh my gosh, here's the movement. Here's the beginnings of a movement to really give this thing legs. And that's what happened. So churches started to affiliate with it. At first, it was just a list, but then it really became a very robust list. Nothing like a denomination. Nobody's in control of anything. It's just, you want to be on the list and you're a progressive church, you're on the list. End of story. So that began to spread. And the lingo, the language, the term progressive Christianity started to get legs. So let me go back in history a bit here. I'll start here. 1651. That was when Tom Hobbes, the great British philosopher, figured out that the books of Moses could not have been written by Moses. And that kicked off an era of the application of scientific methods in academia to the study of the Bible and the Christian tradition. And one thing led to another. You got to the documentary hypothesis, of course. I think many of you are familiar with that. The idea that at least 4 different strands of the Torah were woven together into what we now have as the books of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. So that emerged. So this whole trend of historical, critical, textual analysis of the Scriptures using the scientific method, generally, an academic approach as opposed to a purely theological one, began to take hold in a big way in Germany, but then that spread to Britain and then to the United States. 19th century German Bible scholar Wellhausen was the big advocate of the documentary hypothesis, and a lot of what we now call mainline Protestant pastors in Europe and America embraced this new perspective. They understood that the Bible should no longer be read as a book of definitive facts and eternally valid moral prescriptions. They began to understand that there was mythology involved and humans with axes to grind, different kinds of axes to grind, yes? Different perspectives that are reflected in the Bible and its many books. And so there's a whole literature developed on this. I happen to have with me a couple of I'll undo this here for a second. Show you my these old books I got. Someone gifted me with these 1880s, 1900, and they're just they're progressive Christian literature. Yeah. So it really is no news. Uh, this point of view that the Bible is not a book of facts. It is not a book of eternally valid moral prescriptions. It is a human document. It's humans' words about God, not God's words to humans. So that's kind of essential, or that's generally the point of view of progressive Christianity today. It's not a new idea. Love this quote from this little book from 1900, right? As the pessimism and despair of orthodoxy fades away, like the darkness before the rising sun, it leaves us in a world containing a nobler religion, a grander God, a more hopeful man, a more comprehensive Bible, a better church, and a more inspiring destiny. Rousing words, yes? And, this is reflected in all sorts of other, what we would now call progressive Christian rhetoric. This is the time of very rapid industrialization, technological advance, and health, public health, and electricity, and sewers, and toilets, and this was an era, and there are a world of Christians who believe that Christianity should support that and reflect that and be that, actually, be a force for improvement, social improvement, uh, physical, practical improvement of life, and that spiritual improvement would go with this. Yes. Um, so yeah, you look at the hymnody of early progressive Christianity, and some of it is sort of kind of wildly optimistic about the potential for the future. Yeah, it's a fun literature to look at. But of course, there was a pretty fierce reaction to this point of view. Yes, uh, Christian leaders started to get really upset. Some of them about the idea that the Bible was is the word or the words of people, and all that the documentary hypothesis implied. And these reactions congealed over time. They had many manifestations, of course, but they congealed in a document called the Fundamentals, and this became kind of the guidebook for what we now call the fundamentalist movement. And it had many manifestations, of course, many denominational manifestations. But generally, it was a reaction against the scientific method being applied to the study of the Bible and this evolving, progressing change. Obviously, the theory of evolution, when that came out, that really was a contributing factor to this divide. The churches that embraced it are now what we would call progressive churches. The ones that rejected it are now evangelical / fundamentalist churches. 6-day creationism, etc. So all that conflict in the late 19th century, early 20th century really came to a head with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And the creationists won the trial, but they lost the culture war for sure, right? They were tarred as being hicks, country hicks, uneducated, unschooled folks. And so that kind of relegated the fundamentalist movement into the cultural backwater. There was a kind of quietism, if you will, as far as the role of fundamentalism in public life. Now, before that, there's something else to remember about this era. William Jennings Bryan, who was the lawyer who defended Six-Day Creation in the Scopes monkey trial, was a socialist. He was the Democratic nominee for the presidency 3 times, and he called himself a democratic socialist, right? Fundamentalist Christian, Six-Day Creation believing anti-evolution guy who was a leftist, right? So he was all for progressive social change, at least somewhat. He was a racist too. That was a problem, big problem. But as far as progressive social values otherwise, he was part of that movement. So just a reminder that things have changed and they can change again, yes, as history evolves. Anyway, after the Scopes monkey trial, they won the trial, but they kind of tucked tail and went off into their own universe of their own schools and churches and institutions, and kind of creating a separate universe for fundamentalist Christianities to occupy, a separate media universe, a separate educational universe, etc. Then we get to Big Fundy, yeah, the fundamentalist industrial complex, and this really got going. It's ironic. The place where it got started was First Congregational Church of Los Angeles, which today is a very progressive United Church of Christ congregation. But in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it was where James Fifield held forth from his big pulpit with the biggest pipe organ in America, west of the Mississippi, was in his church. Ton of money there, oil money, etc. Anyway, Fifield was theologically very progressive. He was a documentary hypothesis kind of guy, but he was very conservative politically and socially. And so he put together a coalition of industrialists, big money corporate interests, and said we have to get religion, Christianity, lined up with capitalism to fight against communism and socialism and Roosevelt and the New Deal and all that. So all these terrible evils like Social Security and etc. Bad, right? So he put this group together, and that became a very powerful force. And later, this cabal adopted Billy Graham, and they saw in him a guy who could be a kind of a cleaned up version of fundamentalism, right? A more mainstream, acceptable, culturally slightly more appropriate kind of fundamentalist to support this crusade against communism, socialism, atheism, etc. Right? So that this group became a very powerful force, and that's when you start seeing the emergence of what I would now call the fundamentalist industrial complex, where you have this interlocking huge organizations, tremendously well funded by corporate interests, wealthy people, that have created a alternative universe of information and films and books and curricula and everything else to feed this world of fundamentalism. Now, evangelical, that term became this movement, this alliance of big money interests and fundamentalists. They started to use the term evangelical because fundamentalism it kind of was sort of uncool, just it was associated with backwoods, rural people, uneducated people, and so they wanted a term that was more widely socially acceptable. And so the theology is not very much different. The interpretation of scripture, not much different. But yeah, it's basically a lipstick, right, on fundamentalism, and it stuck, right? That term stuck, and Billy Graham became a bigger deal, and it sort of had a place in the wider culture beyond just the typical constituency of Southern Baptists and the like. Uh, so that was happening, right? But then came the civil rights movement, and then you had the 1983 Bob Jones University court case. Bob Jones would not allow interracial dating, and the government said, well, then you can't have student loans from the federal government for your students. And that enraged Bob Jones folks, and conservative Christians in general were enraged by this. And that lit a match. And then a very freshly energized effort to turn this constituency, who was enraged by basically this strike against racism. You know, the whole thing really was fed by racism at the beginning, at least. The people who were enraged by that, the evangelical fundamentalist constituency, the Republican Party decided, these are our people, let's hook up. By that time, of course, the Southern Democrat politicians who were racist by that time had, in their disappointment and anger that Lyndon Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act, they became Republicans. So the Republican Party was now hoovering up that whole population. Whoops, sorry. And another thing that went with this change, as the Republican Party embraced fundamentalist Christianity, is that suddenly politicians were being put to a theological doctrinal test that they had never had to deal with before, right? They were being checked to see if they were theologically pure by the standards of fundamentalism. And that was new, because up until that point, Christianity's role in political discourse was the civil religion approach, right? Vaguely Christian, vaguely Judeo-Christian values being expressed. But now it's got to be Jesus is Lord, etc. You know, specific doctrinal stances were being demanded of people for the first time. The reaction to that was horror on the part of a lot of more progressive-minded, you know, liberal mainline Protestant folks were horrified at this these theological expectations being put on politicians, and just the general discourse of about Christianity in the culture was embarrassing to more liberal-minded Christians, and so they, you know, they went into a kind of a period of quietude, right? Because the fundamentalist churches were growing, and the mainline churches, more liberal churches, were shrinking, and the trend looked bad, and people were Christians who were not fundamentalists or Republicans were embarrassed to even call themselves Christians. That was going on. It's still a problem, actually. Just afraid that you know, if you say you're a Christian, people are gonna assume you're a John Dobson or Jerry Falwell kind of Christian, right? But just everybody was assuming that. By this point, the definition of Christianity in America had been successfully marketed as being the same as evangelical Christianity. When people see a church, they think it's an evangelical church, that they're anti-gay, they read the Bible literally, ... right? That's the cultural assumption out there about what Christianity is. So a lot of more liberal-minded Christians were embarrassed by this and kind of hunkered down and sort of hid their Christianity sometimes, and more liberal-minded but Christian politicians found themselves kind of shutting up about the whole topic of Christianity because they didn't want to be misunderstood. All right, a real problem. Meanwhile, there was all sorts of ferment on the liberal end of Christianity theologically. John Robinson, Episcopal bishop, 1963, wrote "Honest to God," and in so many words said, the resurrection was an important myth, a life-changing, spiritually powerful myth. Well, that stirred up a lot of anger and upset in the evangelical world. It also got a lot of conversation going on within mainline liberal churches, or a lot of conflict within the mainline liberal denominations about this whole emerging perspective. This is also around the time of, the God is dead discussion. It was all over the news magazines at the time. Radical theologies emerging in the seminaries, and new perspectives coming out, and a lot of turmoil within liberal Protestantism as a result. Later, again, as more liberal churches were kind of floundering and starting to sink and implode, there's a lot of soul searching going on. In the middle of that era, we get John Shelby Spong, Episcopal bishop in New Jersey, who followed up on John Robinson's book and wrote about the idea that the resurrection is mythological in nature. It's spiritually real, factually mythological. Put it right out there. And he was a sitting bishop in the Episcopal Church. Well, that set off he got a lot of press attention around the country for making this statement. And that attention, irritated conservative Christians who say, well, he's not a Christian. It's like they're accusing him of apostasy. But I'd say there's just as much turmoil within the more liberal churches about his statements. But he quickly developed a pretty powerful following, right? Which many of us in the progressive movement, Christian movement, we refer to it as the Church Alumni Association. This might sound familiar to some of you disaffected Adventists, yes? Is there an Adventist Church Alumni Association? Anyway, what you would get, people would show up to, whenever he was on tour all over the country for years, and he had this, he was mobbed wherever he went, mostly by older church members who had been hearing kind of a weak, namby-pamby kind of theology for their whole lives. And to hear somebody just put it out there, a scholarly, brilliant guy with a lovely Southern accent and a gracious fellow, very urbane character, putting out this message, wearing his clerical collar, was electrifying for a lot of these folks. And he's very much connected to the Westar Institute, the Jesus Seminar. Anybody here are familiar with the Westar Institute and the Jesus Seminar? A few. Check it out, people. Please put that in the chat. Westar, Westar Institute. So that's a group of mostly secular-minded or secular biblical scholars of early Christianity, who collectively put together a thing called the Five Gospels, which is the four Gospels plus the Gospel of Thomas. And they did a red, pink, gray, and black version. Red, we're pretty sure Jesus said it. Pink, maybe. Gray, probably not. Black, definitely not. right? Well, that pushed some buttons too, right? Uh, as you can imagine. Uh, but it was put together by serious scholars. I would say, sort of a hopeless quest to really figure that out in any kind of definitive manner. But the quest itself resulted in some marvelous biblical scholarship. Anyway, Spong was part of that. He was a fellow of the Westar Institute, so very much connected to that group, which had a big following in more liberal mainline churches. Um, the problem, as I'm a pastor, right? United Church of Christ pastor. Served churches, and the reality is, if you start having a different point of view, if you start to evolve theologically as a pastor, you're going to run into the Mildred problem or the Edward problem. These are folks who have a lot of money, and if you say something they don't like theologically, they're going to pull their pledge, right? Or not put into the building fund. And so there are, pastors all over the country who have zipped their lips on stuff that they know better about because of Mildred and Edward and their kin, right? So people in the pews, meanwhile, are dying to hear something more sane, realistic, and sound, right? To hear the truth, that no, the Bible is not God's word to people. The Bible is people's words about God. That doesn't make it any less sacred. It makes it more sacred. It makes it more important, because then you really can feel your way into the people who put this stuff together and who read it and heard it first. You can enter into their experience if you have that historical critical perspective. Anyway, Spong, Jesus Seminar, it stirred up a lot of people to get, it's like, we want to hear this from the pulpit, Mildred and Edward be damned. Sorry, it's like, let's not worry about Mildred and Edward anymore. Let's just put it out there here. Let's be real. So there's pressure from educated lay people. And this is something else going on that you all know, right? Your evidence of it right here, right? It's like we have this thing, this newfangled thing called the interwebs, right? Suddenly, suddenly people have access to biblical scholarship and historical scholarship that they never would have had, found or discovered before. So you start getting, particularly in the liberal mainline churches, where there was a tradition of, educated clergy and critical thinking in general. Lay people start to get pretty much as up to date on this stuff as their pastors are or were, but find themselves freer to talk about it than their pastors did because of the Mildred and Edward problem, right? So here we are. Spong really lit a match, and he blew holes in the battleship of evangelical theology, right? Again, early, mid 1990s, Jim Adams puts together what's now called progressivechristianity.org, wrote this welcome statement that's a clear, crisp outline of what progressive Christianity is. Now, I was on the board before, during and after his tenure as the president of the organization. We had numerous discussions about avoiding the paper pope problem. And so if you go to progressivechristianity.org now, you'll see that this list is not here anymore. This 8-point welcome statement has changed because we decided early on we're not going to have one eternal forever breakdown of what progressive Christianity is. We're not going there. We're going to avoid dogma, doctrine, even progressive dogma and doctrine at all costs. So, but this is an early manifestation of it. Excuse me. 2004, turning point, the re-election or the election of George W. Bush, or the appointment by the Supreme Court, depending on your point of view. Anyway, very much supported by evangelical Christians. And when this happened, the media was electrified by this. Like, whoa, these people are powerful. They just elected a president. That was his base. Oh, baby, who are these guys? So suddenly the media is paying attention, and that created an opportunity for progressive Christians to put our message out there. Jim Wallace was the first person to make it to the big time in media on Terry Gross's show. She called him a progressive Christian. We all sighed and groaned because Jim Wallace is not a theologically progressive Christian. He's an evangelical Christian who happens to be a Democrat, basically, right? But Terry called him a progressive Christian, and poof, that was sort of like when that term hit the airwaves, hit the media, hit the internet. Suddenly, people are typing in progressive Christianity and looking for it, right? And that led them to us, progressivechristianity.org and related organizations and movement manifestations. So that was a big, 2004 was a big year for us. The other thing that was going on by that time is we realized it's like, okay, thank you, Jack Spong, for blowing holes in the battleship of fundamentalism, right? Thank you. Meanwhile, are people going to be attracted to a negative movement? Probably not, except for the Church Alumni Association. Those guys were loyal, but we realized, hey, we have to create a positive, attractive culture of Christianity in order to have our churches thrive and for our faith to grow and people to find us. So we had to get busy with that. We had to rewrite the hymnals. That's something I got deep into. I've written a whole bunch of new words for old songs, right? Theologically progressive terminology, not, post supernatural words, right? Post supernatural liturgy, right? Challenging to put this together, right? There's so much old theology is baked in to liturgy, music, etc. So, and curricula for kids, well, that's been a mess all along. It's like, yeah, the mainline this is the thing. Mainline Protestant denominations, Presbyterian, USA, United Methodist, Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ, etc., American Baptist, they try, at least, or they used to try, to be big tents to include evangelicals as well as more progressive folks. The result of that is that they were kind of like what Jesus warned us against about being lukewarm. Yeah, you spit it out. Yeah, it just, you wound up with this namby-pamby stuff coming from the denominational headquarters that was just nowhere. Was neither fish nor fowl. Anyway, so the denominations were not doing the job, so we took it on ourselves, right? Progressive clergy and music makers, writers, hymnody, all that bubbled up from the grassroots to fill this gap. And again, the hub for it, if you want to find it, is all at progressivechristianity.org. That's where you can fan out to see what folks have done in this regard. It's just tremendous creativity has flowered since this time. It's really kind of cool. Then you start getting, as the Republican, as evangelical churches became the Republican Party at prayer, and the Republican Party kept getting more and more extreme, and now we have Trumpism. That really turned off a lot of evangelicals, particularly young evangelicals, who were just very frustrated by the contradictions that they saw in their churches, um, deeply disturbed by them. So this led to a lot of questioning among particularly young evangelicals. Rachel Held Evans was kind of the poster person for this world of ex-evangelicals. She was born in Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes trial was held. Grew up fundamentalist, started asking the questions, and then started blogging about her questions and got a lot of attention from other evangelical, mostly young folks. Very sincere, earnest, devoted, devout kind of evangelical Christian to her core, but unable to just keep on nodding along with the backwards theology and politics of the world she was in. So her books became bestsellers. She was a big deal. Died young of cancer, very sadly. It would be so interesting to see what she would be saying today. I think she'd be a very big, big figure today if she had lived, even bigger. But that she represented this big exodus of particularly young people out of evangelical land, and they're looking, like, now what? Where do I go? Right? You get writers like Brian McLaren. Anybody read his stuff? I bet some of you have. A real important ex-evangelical figure. As he made his movement, he started out saying, I'm an evangelical. I'm just, making space here for people with multiple points of view, for different political, social views. Called himself an emergent Christian at first. In the late 2000s. And then slowly, steadily, now he would call himself a progressive Christian totally. He and I worked together, actually. He and I started something called Zoe, Progressive Christian Life on Campus. We're a national network of progressive Christian campus ministry group. He is a wonderful, wonderful man, the nicest, kindest person. And this is the gift of ex-evangelicals. There's this earnestness, this sincerity, this devotion to Jesus and to the heart of the soul and the soul of the faith that remains even as they deconstruct the dogma that they grew up with. And Brian is just a beautiful example of that. Yeah, still a person of deep, deep faith who has moved on from the dogma and the politics and the throwback social values. So now there's this whole world of ex-evangelical pastors who still have this, amazing leadership skills. Their churches have imploded or blown up or whatever. They've lost their churches. There's a lot of sad stories about that. But they still are out there being leaders. And then there's a whole nother world of CCMs, right? Contemporary Christian music folks who have dropped out of evangelical land and are still making music, but with progressive content. And they're amazing. They are amazing. Check them out. So they've still got that energy and that style of evangelical Christianity without the throwback dogma and doctrine and social values. New institutions are emerging. New churches are bubbling out of this that are ex-evangelical churches. Really, they never were mainline churches. They used to be evangelical. Now they're progressive churches in every way. LGBTQI fully affirming. Of course, that has been the bright line in the last few decades, is that one issue, right? If you want to find a progressive church, you look for the rainbow flag. And pretty much every one of those churches is not only fully affirming, but also theologically progressive, or at least welcoming of that perspective. New institutions forming, the Wild Goose Festival. I commend that to you all. I go to it every year. Our Zoe, we have a presence there. Brian and I speak together about campus ministry there. It's in North Carolina. It's a weekend of fun. It's like Woodstock for progressive Christians and for ex-evangelicals. There are probably more ex-evangelicals there than there are mainline folks. It's fun. It's real fun. Then, in very recent years, we get the double epidemic of Trump and COVID, right? Kind of go together. So the horror that millions of evangelicals felt when they saw that their pastors were endorsing this person drove them out of their churches. They just couldn't do it anymore. And then the refusal to mask up or to social distance by many, many, many evangelical pastors, that just, that blew the minds of a lot of evangelicals. They couldn't even fathom it, and they walked, they left, and they're out in the wilderness. Some of them are finding their way to progressive churches. The problem is with the mainline churches is that we have up to date, good theology and social values, and ancient history worship styles, right? So that's where the convergence of the ex-evangelicals with the progressives is so marvelous, because you start to get much livelier worship combined with progressive theology. The combo there is wonderful, and it's changing our churches rapidly as these ex-evangelicals find their way into progressive churches that have been progressive all along. So there it is. We are asked not to be orthodox. We are asked to be other docs, right? To be focused on others, as Jesus was focused on others, as love is about others. Yes? Otherdoxy. That is following the admonition to love God and love neighbors. That's what Christianity is all about from the progressive perspective.
Thank you very much, Jim.
And on that note, let's have a chat.
Yeah, let me just mention to all of you, this is the time to raise your hands, formulate your question, raise your hands. Let's get a good discussion going here. Remember, we try to be open-minded and respectful of one another. And as people are thinking of questions, I'm going to start here, Jim. It's amazing to me how often I still hear Dean Kelly's book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, invoked as some kind of truth that has never gone away. The title alone is the truth that why conservative churches are growing. The book was written in 1972. I was graduating from high school then. And if people are still saying why conservative churches are growing. And the fact of the matter is, conservative churches are very powerful and they have grown in power, Jim, but I don't think that they're necessarily growing in numbers that much anymore. The truth of the matter is that Southern Baptists are losing members just as fast as other churches are at this point.
Yep.
But it seems to be a sort of understanding. And this is very true of Adventists. What I'm describing here is true of Adventists too. That once people start to deconstruct a little bit of their faith, even a little bit of it, with Adventists, it can be ever so little, like Ellen White is not the last word, for example.
Yeah.
As soon as they start to deconstruct a little bit, they say, well, what the hell? What's the point? No point in being a Christian at all anymore. Let's just walk away from the whole business. There's no faith that's worth the trouble because When you pulled out the rug from under what I always believed, you have now taken away every reason to be any kind of Christian whatsoever. If there is evolution, what's the point of being a Christian? If the Bible isn't the precise words of God, what's the point of being a Christian? You know what I'm talking about, Jim. You've heard this before. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yes, we can. Two things in response. One is, yes, the evangelical churches are shrinking. There's an exodus. And, 20 years ago, evangelical Christian leaders thought of us progressives as meaningless, silly, who cares? They're all dying off. We don't have to even deal with them. They're a joke. That's how they looked at us 20 years ago. Today, we are Satan's agents. We are sent by the devil to lead their people astray. Evangelical leaders using violent, scary language are blaming progressive Christians for their own decline for the first time. It's the best advertising we ever got. It has raised our profile tremendously because of this. You got bloggers, oh man, Alyssa Childers, check her out, raging and ranting against progressive Christian. They didn't pay any attention to us at all, right? Before, but now they do. It's good, and it's also, frankly, kind of scary. The era we're entering into of this, violent, scary Christian nationalism. Oh boy, a lot of it is, we progressive Christians are being blamed as agents of Satan. On the other topic about, well, Ellen White was not a real prophet, then the whole thing falls apart. Well, this is what happens in evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. They have built a house of cards, right? This edifice, and everything is interlocked, and all of it is essential. All these dogmas and doctrines and belief systems are essential, right? And so they're stacked up like a house of cards. And if you pull one of them out, the whole thing goes down. And it's like, why bother, right? The evangelicals have been taught it's all or nothing, right? Christianity is evangelical Christianity. There is no other Christianity. Everything else. That's why evangelicals talk about being non-denominational. Let's be real. Most, at least half of the non-denominational churches out there belong to denominations.
Yeah.
Right? They're Southern Baptists that don't want to tell you that they're Southern Baptists. They leave that off their listings. They belong to a network that amounts to the same thing as the denomination. Willow Creek, it's a denomination, really. But they won't tell you that. Why? Because they want to be just JST, no you, just Christian, right? I'm just Christian. Normative, there's normative Christianity equals fundamentalism, right? That's what they've marketed. They've been very effective at marketing that. That's why when normal, Americans who aren't even Christians drive down the street and see church, they go, oh, conservative, anti-gay people, anti-abortion people, and so on. So they've succeeded, and the way they maintain that is by denying that they are anything but just Christians, right? And everybody's like, if you're a Catholic Christian, well, maybe you're a Christian. I don't know. Progressive Christian, that's bad, right? So, what they're doing is trying to make everybody but them a marked term in linguistics, right? A marked term would be like the word woman. Woman is marked. Men is not marked, right? Whoa, man is like a version of man, right? Linguistics. So they're smart about this. They want to make every kind of Christianity that's not them into a marked term and therefore lesser and subordinate to their true faith, right? So having set things up that way, then when people start to deconstruct, they go, well, then I'm out, right? I'll give you an example. I'm very good friends with a guy who come on now, I'm spacing out. I'm having a senior moment. Uh, anyway, it'll come to me. But a well-known atheist figure, right? And he Bart Campolo, his dad, Tony Campolo, famous evangelist, unusual in that he was a Democrat. Anyhow, his son, Bart, became, followed in his father's footsteps, became a fundamentalist preacher, evangelical preacher, had a whole following. He's very earnest and charming and handsome and a terrific, speaker and communicator. Anyway, one day he was riding his bicycle and fell off and had a concussion. And when he woke up, he realized he didn't believe any of it anymore. Right?
Never heard that story.
It's sort of upside down for a lot of people think, people are fundamentalists bump their heads. It's like, well, in this case, he bumped his head and gave it all up. Right? Anyway, so suddenly he's like this notable atheist, right? Advocate for atheists. Anyway, my boss and I recruited him to become the chaplain to our atheist club at USC, University of Southern California. He was amazing. He took a group of 4 angry atheist students, turned it into a huge group of 75 kids who would show up. They were all about positive values and kindness and love. And they followed him around like ducklings because he was so wonderfully personable, charming, evangelical to the core, right? Even though he'd given up the theology. But I had these convos with him. I gave him my book, one of my books, and I go, check this out. He read it. He says, oh, Jim, he says, if I had read this 5 years ago, maybe I'd still be a Christian. And I go, well, it's not too late, But my point here is that Bart was taught from the cradle, taught that you're either in or you're out, right? Period. There's only one Christianity. And he would argue with me about this. He said, you can't really be a Christian and believe that stuff. You can't say that God is just love and not a supernatural entity and be a Christian. I'm going, dude, I'm the Christian. You're the atheist, But the reason he was so stuck there is because he was still an evangelical in his viewpoint about the nature of Christianity, right? He thought that is Christianity. Come on now, Jim. That can only be Christianity. I'm like, no, dude, this is old news. Everything I'm saying is old news. Old books, right? None of this is news. Oh, really, Jim?
But a lot of Adventists feel that same way.
Yes.
Like we get this a lot. People say, well, this is how the church is. And I say, well, here's a group of Adventists who aren't like that. Well, yeah, but I insist that it has to be. I am going to insist that you have to be that way. And we have to hate you because we don't like this anymore. And we say, no, we still love the community we're part of. I learned about Jesus here. I was educated here. I can still make a difference here. They say, yeah, but if you don't believe it 100%, you have to leave. And I say, no, I don't. I can still love people, right?
It makes you nuts. It makes you nuts. The craziest conversations I have about this stuff are with atheists, angry atheists. And I tell them, well, what God don't you believe in? The guy in the sky, blah, blah, blah. And I don't, we don't believe in that. That's not God. They go, what do you mean? What do you mean? And then they're mad at me. And they think, you're not a Christian. It's like, well, but you're the atheist. I'm the Christian.
This is exactly the conversations I have with Adventists all the time.
It just cracks you up. And what you're looking at here, Warren, is the success of of the Fundy industrial complex in convincing all of America, or most of it, that evangelical Christianity, Republican Christianity, is Christianity. Period. They succeeded.
Problem, of course, Jim, is that if you walk into any given progressive Christian church here in Columbus, Ohio, the ones who call themselves progression, you're going to find 4 people in the Episcopal Church and maybe 12 in the UCC Church and a handful more in the Presbyterian Church. And so in terms of doing the meet in the church building and do the thing, pretty hard to find one.
It is. It's a real problem. Meanwhile, you will find stellar counter examples, right, all over the country.
Sure.
Amazing, power, very lively, large, progressive Christian churches. We're out there. We have the congregations. They're not near as ubiquitous as they once might have been, but we're there. And a lot of the liveliest churches are the ones that are hoovering up these ex-evangelicals
Mhm.
and hoovering up their energy and their music and their liturgical gifts and their commitment to social, to acts of kindness and activism. So yes, most progressive churches are shrimpy little groups of people where I would be the youngster,
Mhm, mhm.
That's
Mm.
very true. Meanwhile, lots of wonderful, I give you the list, counter examples that you can find around the country.
One that comes to mind is All Saints Episcopal in Pasadena. Carmen and I go to Pasadena quite frequently. Hey, I've been hogging the conversation here, and it's time
Sorry
to let
about that. Let's
Bobby and Ray in here. Ray and Bobby, join the conversation.
please.
I have a question. Well, more of a asking for your comments about how certain words get changed in their meaning due to politics and religion mixing together. And of course, the current word that is the most demonized is the word woke. What are your comments about that?
Well, woke is a word that can be flipped, right? I would say that there's such a thing as the woke rate, right? If you dare to suggest that there's any lingering effects of racism on our social structures today, oh no, 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 no. These people they can't handle it. These guys are snowflakes. These are the snowflakes, the ones that cannot handle our children learning about the simple fact that there are gay people and there are trans people and that racism was and still is a thing. They're snowflakes. They melt at the mere thought. They're woke. They're the woke right. Yeah. We just have to, it's like this is it's just a bunch of baloney. It's easy to turn this stuff on its head. It's like the right wingers are the people who are wimps that can't handle dealing with this stuff. It's like what makes America great? The fact that we recognize our problems, our lingering issues, and we deal with them. That's what makes America great, right? That's what makes us patriots, is that we're doing something about racism and its lingering effects. It's like we're not embarrassed to be Americans. We're proud to be Americans we're patriotic Americans who get out there and solve the problems of our country, right? That's what makes our country great. So we just have to, we have to reclaim our religion. We have to reclaim our patriotism. In front of my house is a big flag. My Trumper neighbor, when I put it up, when I moved here, so I put up the flag. my Trumper neighbor came over and says, "I like your flag." And I said, "I like my flag too." Yeah. And we shook hands and slapped each other's backs. And then a few months later, I had the, Biden Harris sign up there. And surprise, surprise. We're the patriots, right? We're the Christians. We're trying, they're Christians too. They're patriots too. Total respect on that, right? But we just have to turn this lingo around, right? We can't let it stick because it doesn't stick.
Especially since Jesus was a determinedly woke sort of person and accepting people, wasn't he? Ed Zerkwitz. Ed, how are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Good. Well, join this conversation. You got a little bit of an echo there, Ed. I don't know if you need to turn something down.
Yes, okay. Thanks for pointing that out. I appreciate your presentation today. And while you were presenting, I went on your website, and there's a lot of information there. But I did see things like how to treat other people, looking after the marginalized, social justice, things like that. So,
yeah.
Anyways, my question for you is very simple or very complicated, depending on how you look at it. How do you view in terms of your presentation, how do you view the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Well, I have a great history with it because I went to high school in Soquel, California. Y'all know where that is, right? So I lived about a mile from your camp. So I would go up to the camp in the summertime when I was a teenager to check out the girls. Yeah. And eat the veggie burgers, which tasted like cardboard. Your veggie burgers are now much better, I must say. Anyway, but I have warm, happy memories of Adventists in Santa Cruz, and just it's sweet. It was a sweet energy there. So good feeling from day one. Then getting to know dear Lauren and another mutual friend of ours, Karen, and getting more familiar with Adventism. Also, I took I went on a reading jag about American religion, the unique American religions. And that really helped me a lot to understand the Adventist tradition. There's a book out there. I'm sure many of you have seen it. I'll put it in the chat. Read this book, The Burned Over District. Anybody read that? Any hands? Aha, Warren has read it. Okay, this is a cool, 4 others. All right, check this book out. You'll love it. It's the history of Christianity in upstate New York in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Yeah?
Basically,
the late 1700s and the early 1800s, excuse me. It is so rich, and it's just about the whole ferment that was going on culturally and religiously that was the frontier in those days, right?
Yes.
Upstate New York was still the frontier. It was a wild and crazy place, so all these different religious manifestations bubbling up. So Adventism is part of this rich history of religion in this country. And, the breathtaking creativity that it represents. There's creativity there. And, the figure of Ellen White is just that story about, how she got hit in the head with a rock and then had auras. And, this is a rich history, right? And very American. And I think, as Lauren was saying, there's this sort of, something lost to our awareness is just that there's that creativity means change, right? So you have this creative woman who interprets the faith in a fresh way and invites others to do the same. And then it turns into, the paper pope and then all that stuff, just how things go, with institutions, fossil
Yeah,
like. So I'm just saying I have warm fuzzies for you guys, and I really appreciate the struggles that you have dealing with a very rigidly harsh fundamentalist leadership.
yeah.
That's sad because it's not reflective of who Ellen White was at all. So I get that.
It's not reflective of who a lot of American and European Adventists are either.
Yes.
And yet they just keep, our leaders keep doubling down on that. They've gone so far in recent years, Jim, as to say that Ellen White said that there would be a shaking in the church and you guys should all be shaken out. I mean, it just blows my mind that you would have leaders of a church who say, we don't really want you here.
Men leaders.
Male leaders, all male leaders. Yep.
The church founded by a woman. Amazing. But this is, it's not just your problem. It's religion in general. Institutions go through this stuff. And so, what you're doing in this group is bubbling up from below, and that's where things change, right?
Yeah.
That's where the action's at. And I hope you don't despair. Do you guys know about the blogger knackle? I'll put it in the chat. Okay. So LDS Church, there's a big world of disaffected, loyal disaffected and ex-disaffected Mormons, LDS people, right? And there's a very rich universe of blogs, podcasts, literature, etc., collectively known as the Blogger Knackle. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir, this is the Mormon Blogger Knackle, and it's huge. And I would invite y'all in Adventist land to learn from them because they're really quite good at what they do. There's a really robust world of media and curricula and material for people in that category, that growing category. The only reason that the LDS Church is doing okay in the United States is just reproduction, right?
Huh.
Seriously, if they didn't have 6 kids, 4 of whom are going to drop out, and they're all dropping out like crazy, then they wouldn't be able to maintain their numbers. It's just that simple. So they're in trouble, and they know it. Little aside here is that back in 2009, I went with a small group of interfaith leaders from LA to Mormon headquarters in Salt Lake and met with the top dogs, the quorum of the 70 and the top floor of LDS headquarters. We got to meet with these folks, men. Wow. Learned a lot. And my discussion with them, my convo, I say, well, you guys won Prop 8 in California where you ban gay marriage. The Mormon Church was all in to ban gay marriage in California. I go, you won the battle, but you lost the war. You know that. You're losing this culture war. Gay marriage is just, it's happening. It's over for you on this topic. So I asked, what's your plan B? We know, we read the statistics, blah, 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 but we're never going to change. So that's what you guys are up against too, doubling down. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, the folks are finding other ways to do their LDS life. Right.
And we here at Adventist today, I think we probably are sort of the equivalent of the
You're it.
tabernacle. We try to make room for everyone, and that includes people who are transgender and gay and unbelievers and partial believers and everybody else. That's what we want to be. I often say, Jim, that my goal is to make a safe space where you can sort through what it is you've been taught, keep the things that are good, toss the things that aren't good, and I hope you find enough good that you can still be part of our community, if not part of our church.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
very hard to find a congregation for a progressive Adventist to be part of unless you live in Southern California. It's pretty difficult. Or parts of Florida. There's a few of them around, but not too many. Arthur, I see you raise your hand, and I think I've got you unmuted. Arthur, join in this conversation, please.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I thought I was paying pretty close attention, but a text came in from my daughter, and I may have missed something you said. Could you speak again to the 1957 history of the United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, and the Congregationalist Church, and the tensions between progressive Christianity and evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, well, the United Church of Christ. This is. Thank you for raising that issue, because the history is telling, right? So on the one hand, in the 50s, you had the 30s and 40s, but then very much stronger in the 50s. You get the fundamentalist industrial complex, right? This, I would say, unholy wedding of big money capital with conservative religion. So that's going on. But at the same time, you have the liberal Protestants having a corporate mindset, right? So the denominations are, but they're starting to realize we need to work together. We should work together, So they created 475 Riverside in New York City, this big, imposing edifice, right? And that's going to be the headquarters of the liberal Protestant denominations. And then we're going to join them. We're going to have the United Church of Christ, one grand and glorious institution, right? This is like this building with men with white collar, the clerical collars, holding briefcases and going in and saying hello to their women secretaries with big black telephones and file cabinets, corporate religion, corporate Christianity, right? So Christianity, liberal Protestants we were trying to be IBM, CBS, we're trying to be corporate, right? Headquarters in a big skyscraper in New York City. Ridiculous, right? It all fell apart. The grand and glorious vision of the United Church of Christ collapsed because the denominations didn't really want to, end themselves and merge, really. They had their own interests and constituencies. So my denomination is a relic of a vision, right? I always say, the trouble with denominational identity is that nobody can figure out Seventh-day Adventist. What does that mean? That's out there. But then try to spell Presbyterian, right? What's Methodist? That's like a chiropractic treatment, Lutherans, is that some kind of mouthwash? It's like nobody doesn't mean it. But it's all a legacy of corporate thinking. It doesn't make any sense at all anymore, right? So that's one thing. As far as the relationship with evangelicals, I've talked about that quite a bit here. I don't know if I need to keep going deeper into that, but again, evangelical theology was in. There were lots of Presbyterians in the PCUSA, the main Presbyterian denomination, that were evangelical. They would go to Billy Graham rallies, right? Crusades. And then go to liberal Protestant church. But what they're hearing from the pulpit is kind of this namby-pamby, mush, right? Because the pastor is trying to make Mildred and Edward happy. I grew up in a church like that. It's the saddest thing in the world. There's this one old lady in that church. She's 96 years old. And I know that the pastor won't say the progressive message because he is afraid that she will not drop an endowment on the church when she dies. Really. That's how bad it is out there. So evangelicalism was in these churches, these we're big tents, right? And we're still big tents. Like, hey, you believe Jesus really physically arose from the dead? You're cool. Welcome to our progressive church. We don't have a problem with that at all. We just aren't going to teach that necessarily. We're not going to require that of everybody to believe that. But we certainly welcome people with many different points of view. My point here is those folks, the denominations are trying to be big tents. They're trying to accommodate conservative and more progressive liberal theology. And it didn't work out so well. But now the evangelicals have left the Presbyterian Church USA. They have left the United Church of Christ. They have left the Methodist Church, as you can see, falling apart right now, right? And what's going to be left is our small, progressive, pretty uniformly progressive, theologically and socially, churches, denominations. So this project that I'm working on with Brian McLaren about campus ministry is about just that. It's like, okay, we've created an umbrella organization that Presbyterian campus ministries and Methodist campus ministries and Lutheran campus ministries can belong to, that's explicitly progressive, right?
Is that the same Brian McLaren who was the director of education at Center for Action and Contemplation?
Same guy.
That's him?
I just put it up here. Senator, check this out. Thank you for bringing this up, Arthur. So do hands about anybody familiar with Richard Rohr, Center for Action and Contemplation? Some, yeah. Check this out, people. It's a big deal. Okay. Richard Rohr, Franciscan monk and brilliant interpreter of the Christian contemplative tradition. Brilliant. Very progressive Catholic who couches everything he says in nihil obstat. By that I mean everything he says stays inside the doctrinal boundaries, but his interpretation of those boundaries is gorgeous, brilliant, and creative. He's amazing. He's kind of a great role model, I think, for all sorts of folks that are in churches that have a pretty rigid dogma like your own, right? There's a template there about how to work within the system, right? Anyway, this guy would not be as well. He's very well known. He has a huge following with his blog. Yeah, puts out a daily meditation. It's just terrific. I get it myself. He has a huge following of Catholics, many of them disaffected Catholics. And by the way, that's a whole nother universe for us all to watch. But he would not be very well known, except that a bunch of ex-evangelicals found their way to him and brought with them their expertise in media. One of them, Brian McLaren, right? The ex-evangelicals made him a big deal. Now, what we see with Richard Rohr is something happening generally in progressive Christianity, and that is increased interest in the mystical contemplative tradition of Christianity. And because it's the good stuff, right? And another thing about it is that it's never been about doctrine, really, right? The mystics of Christianity often, some of them got burned at the stake because they weren't about the dogma so much. They weren't against it, but they creatively interpreted it to express the spiritual journey. I'm deep into this. I lead a group, which any of you are welcome to join. I put my email up here. Every Wednesday at 5 PST for an hour, we do the mystics together and delve into that, right? And then do meditative contemplative practice. This is becoming a bigger and bigger deal in progressive Christianity. And it's a very healthy thing because it's the juice. This is the spiritual practice, not about belief, but about practice.
What's the practice?
and it's ancient, and it's no news, right? It goes all the way back.
Arthur, if I'm not mistaken, your wife graduated from San Francisco Theological Seminary. Is that right?
That's right. She retired this summer from. She was the director of chaplain services at Loveless Hospital, and she is now a part-time bedside chaplain at University of New Mexico Health.
Beautiful.
New Mexico is Jim's place, by the way. You should know that. Linda, it's your turn. Let me unmute you here. There you go.
All right.
Thank you, Arthur.
Yes. Jim, thank you for your presentation. I found it quite intriguing. I have read Brian McLaren's book, Do I Stay Christian? And I was just fascinated by it. And in fact, there's one little sentence that, for those of you that might not have read it, in his the appendix, he says, a group of progressive Seventh-day Adventists might say, quote, we grew up in this community and love much of our heritage, but our status is unclear because we aren't sure how much the church will be able to change to accommodate people like us. Yeah. And sadly, I think that's certainly how I feel. And I think it's how many of us on this Zoom call today feel as well. But I have a question for you. You had you coined an interesting phrase, or at least you said it, and I had not heard it in quite the way you presented it. You used the term deconstructing dogma, and you talked about it in the context of Brian McLaren and other evangelicals, and perhaps a broader application as well. But I'm curious about that process. How does that get started? Deconstructing dogma? Is it individualistic? Is it collective? What are the risks and pitfalls and sacrifices? What is the ultimate trajectory of that? How have you seen that work? What would you say to us about that?
Great question. Thank you. The process, well, it certainly varies among folks. In my own experience, I've spent a lot of time with people deconstructing, right? And reconstructing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Realizing that the theological structure they grew up with or that they're surrounded by just is not working for them for one reason or another anymore. And now what, right? So it gets going in different ways. The LGBTQ problem is the biggie, right? People it's like youngsters. They're like, what? Why would anybody question the reality of queer people, same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage? It's inconceivable to them that this could be a problem, right? It's just it's doesn't make any sense. And so this is the thing that's happening in evangelical churches now and fundamentals, is that they hide that. They don't want anybody to know that they're not friendly, that ultimately they're anti-gay sex. They don't want you to know that. So that's another reason that Brian and I started Zoe. It's like we put it right up there. It's like LGBTQI plus affirming 100%. Mm-hmm. Because kids will go to InterVarsity when they get to school, to college, and they'll think, oh, these people are cool, skinny jeans, cool music, blah, blah, blah. And then they're into it for 2 years, and then they realize, oh, these guys are anti-gay marriage, they're anti-gay anything, they're weird. How do they fall in with this crew, Yeah. But their leaders don't want you to know that. Right? They don't want, they hide that. They downplay it. Or their latest tactic is the third way. We're a third way church, which basically is their way of weaseling out of making a choice between being affirming and not, which means that they're not affirming. There is no third way. It's like either you're.
So is that deconstructing dogma in sheep's clothing? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that the kids don't even know what they're in.
All right.
But when they find out what they're in, that they've been sucked into this group, that they've been integrated into this community, that is anti-gay, they just go, what? And they freak out. They're like, what? And they're completely blown away, right? And then that issue is what starts them thinking maybe this. Then they start to question the whole thing, and because they've been taught evangelical normative Christianity, that there's only one Christianity, and it's evangelical. Because they've been taught that, then it's like, oh well, then I'm out. If I can't.
There's no other option. No other option then.
Yeah, that's what they've been taught. So there are a lot, sadly, most youngsters leaving evangelical land just leave and it's like, bye. They want nothing to do with any of it ever again. Right? That's sad. But again, because of the career I've had, university chaplain work, one after another, after another, after another, kids, youngsters coming in to talk about their deconstruction process. And the gay issues, what science, of course, 6-day creationism, they hear that, they go, what? That breaks it down. Just the whole biblical literalism thing and the essentially, frankly, absurdity of that. It's absurd. And people, particularly at elite universities, kids who are, taught to think critically are like, well, no, this doesn't make any sense. So many reasons to get started down that path. But again, some of them, there's got to be something left in Christianity worth pursuing and maintaining. But how do I do that? Right.
Mhm.
And that's where this movement comes in. We have a whole world of resources for them to.
I was going to say, Lauren, I think this is an incredible opportunity. I know that AT has been interested in how to reach a younger population, and given the median age of this group, that's certainly well considered, I think. But I recommend that you start a new column, Deconstructing Dogma, and deal with each one of the FBs, the fundamental beliefs, one at a time. Think of all the opportunities for use and reuse of such a compilation.
Really great idea. Really great idea. In fact, I thought you were going to suggest that we should, even though what it means to be progressive for us isn't quite the same as what it might mean for a UCC person, Jim, I would like to be part of your community if I possibly could, representing our small group of people who are in the process. A lot of us, deconstructing is exactly what we're doing all the time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. That's good. Great suggestion. And thank you for joining in the conversation. Sydney, let me get you on here. Sydney is one of our Adventist Today board members, actually, and very helpful. And Sydney represents those people who are in a place where they really can't find a good congregation to really be part of, as I recall. Isn't that right, Sydney?
Yes, I happen to be on an academic sabbatical, so I'm in Atlanta. So I have a few more options right now, but it still stands regarding kind of navigating where I am within our faith community. But thank you for the opportunity to ask a question, and thank you, Jim, for your wonderful presentation. A few days ago, Donnie Swaggart, who is Jimmy Swaggart's son, publicly chastised and rebuked the Black church. In particular, he was speaking to the endorsement of Kamala Harris by the president or chief bishop of the Church of God in Christ, which is the largest African-American denomination in the United States. And so that has been controversial, along with recently one of our former, what we call the General Conference, which is our primary religious body, the top leaders, one of the former vice presidents of that group, Dr. Calvin Rock, endorsed Kamala Harris also. With that being said, I would love for you to talk about the conservative side, but then also the more progressive white Christians. So what I find even in progressive Christian and Seventh-day Adventist spaces is that it's been hard to decenter whiteness, right? So whenever we have conversations like we're having today, people may be more comfortable talking about LGBTQ or other types of disability diversity because they could see their niece or nephew or grandchild in those particular identities. But when it comes to African Americans or others, that may be a little harder to kind of navigate. So can you talk about the issue of race, both from the progressive side, but also the conservative side, as we're talking about this kind of political quagmire that we're in right now?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Just yes to what you're saying, as far as amen to the reality that you're pointing toward. Yeah, uh, yes, the progressive theology, right? So the historical critical method of reading the scripture, um, non-literalistic approach to interpreting it, post-supernatural theology, all that is, let's face it, very white. Yeah. Um, and that's that's problematic, right? Because then the fact is that politically left or progressive, if you will, politically liberal black churches and black church folks may have really quite traditional theological perspectives, right? Um, Understanding the resurrection to be literal and so on, right? That is a reality, and so white progressives have to respect that, right? Have to be awake to that and respect that and all that goes with it, right? Uh, so there's some blind spots in white progressive Christianity, Christian world, and I think you're right on about that. So uh, the more dialogue is happening within and among those worlds, the better. Now we do have some pretty interesting black um, theological progressives, right? Anybody familiar with Carlton Pearson? I'll put him in the blog.
He's the fellow. I think he passed away, Jim, didn't he?
Yeah, recently. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the fellow who left the black church because he could not believe in ever burning hell. There's been a couple of documentaries about him. He's was a really great guy.
Yeah, I preached with him at Foundry Methodist in D.C. about 15 years ago. Uh, Maybe I should just say I was another speaker with him completely blowing everybody away. Boy, I was a bit player in that show. I'll have you know. Anyway, that guy is amazing. So he was Oral Roberts' protege. He was Oral Roberts' black sidekick in the Pentecostal Christian world, right? So he had a huge church, 5,000 members in Tulsa. Carlton Pearson, pastor, and then he kind of woke up to he was done with the whole idea of hell and hellfire and eternal damnation. He had a sermon he preached. It was "Get the hell out of Christianity." It was great. And this is a guy who would preach, incredible preacher, and then break out into song spontaneously. You know, he was a phenomenal preacher and performer. Anyway, he starts talking about how there's no hell, and uh, and then just went further and further down the progressive road and embraced LGBTQI affirmation, etc. Most of his church people walked away. Church shrank down, lost a couple thousand members, most of the members. Very frustrated. Then he got cancer, and that was a very sad story. But there's a guy, right? Another one, Bishop Yvette Flunder. Check her out. She is next level too. United Church of Christ pastor. Before she joined the UCC, she was a Pentecostal preacher, declared herself to be a bishop, which was, for a woman, semi-radical in that world. Ran a whole huge AIDS ministry in San Francisco. Steadily moved. She was always socially progressive. Steadily moved in a theologically progressive direction, and is a terrific interpreter of that in the Black church context. So there are folks with this perspective, but respecting the difference for a lot of folks between their politics and their theology is something we have to be very sensitive to in connection with the Black church. Does that help? Or make any sense? Am I missing the point or catching your drift?
Yeah, Sydney, do you want to respond to that? You muted yourself. Go ahead.
Yes, no, that was good. Just but also could you speak to the conservative side? So with kind of like Jimmy Swaggart's son kind of rebuking the Black church. Could you speak to that side also?
Well, that's the sign of the times, right? And I think what we're hearing more of that kind of lingo from people like Swaggart because they're desperate, because their movement is going down, right? Their churches are emptying, and they're freaking out, and they're blaming other people for their troubles, right? Mm. And just this whole unholy union of conservative religion with Trumpism, et cetera, is just the damage that's done to churches, evangelical churches, much less the reputation of the faith in general is just terrible. It's terrible. And it's a cause for a lot of this deconstruction that's going on.
Ed, join the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to make a brief statement, and then I want to ask you a question, Jim.
Sure.
Contemplation arose in our conversation briefly a few minutes ago.
Yes.
And I just want to comment on that from a personal perspective. And I wish John McClarty were still on because he preceded me in a certain path. I was reading a book called, I think it's Finding Magic Eels. And it is about mysticism and the contemplative life. And it got me interested in the subject. And so, contrary to good Christian advice, I abandoned for a while, at least for a test period, the notion of you got to read your Bible first thing in the morning, have your devotions. And I started sitting on my couch looking out a window where I can see a nearby rock peak capped mountain.
Nice.
And just sat there and tried to be silent in my mind, which some Christians would say is dangerous because the devil will fill it immediately, like God has no power. And as I kept trying to do this day after day, I find interesting thoughts finding their way into my mind, thoughts which I don't think I would have thought myself. And I just wanted to throw that out in case anybody's interested, that, it's kind of like Elijah's experience where God was not in the thunder and lightning or the wind. He was in the still small voice. So it's just been an interesting journey I've been on recently, experimenting with the contemplative type approach to my devotions. My question is this. I've been trying to noodle in my mind while we've been talking how, if somebody asked me, how I would try to define conservative religion versus progressive religion. And I suppose you could give a list of characteristics for each one, but it felt to me as I've been thinking about it that conservatism might be marked more by guidelines and dogma, and progressivism might be characterized more by loving relationships. And I'm sure that's a very limited definition, but how far away from reality are these two things that I've mentioned?
Right on. I'm with you. Yeah, maybe another way to put it is, conservative or evangelical fundamentalist religion and conservative Catholicism certainly too. They're focused on belief, right? And essentially, belief is like a rule or a norm. So the beliefs also are related to rules and behave. Do this, don't do this, and do this, right? Excuse me. Kind of a legalistic approach. Progressive Christianity, I would suggest, is about practice. It's about the practice of love. Love is a bunch of work, Some people say, "Oh, you're taking the easy way out."
Right.
Christianity is supposed to be hard. You're supposed to believe things that are hard to believe, and it's like, wait a minute, what is harder, really? What's harder, to believe that the earth was created in 6 days, or to love your neighbor, who's a pain in the ass? You know what I'm saying? What is harder, to love your enemy, or to believe the unbelievable? In America, we have an entire city a huge city devoted to believing the unbelievable. Do you know the name of that city? Las Vegas. Right? So it's like, it's easy to believe the unbelievable, or else Las Vegas would be out of business, right? My point being, it's a lot harder to practice. Okay, if you're, let me flash a book at you. Read this. The Desert Fathers. Third, fourth, fifth century Christianity, monasticism, monks living in huts in the desert, doing contemplative practice all the time. And you know what? It was hard. It's hard to pay attention. It's hard to watch your thoughts. It's hard to let go of what's in the way of union with the divine. That's a bunch of work, good work, but it is work. That's a lot harder than going to some fundamentalist church and waving your hand, all this stuff. That's easy.
I agree with you, and I think that's the path Jesus was laying out when he said, "Don't kill." It's not enough to refrain from killing somebody.
Yeah.
You got to go further and not hate them, which is actually harder than not killing somebody, because killing somebody always carries the threat of jail time.
Right.
But to love my neighbor all the time in any circumstance, that's much more challenging. So I agree with your characterizations of the two poles here.
Another way of expressing it, maybe, is this that I find useful. Progressive Christianity is about an attraction to a center, the communion table. Let that be the image, right? We're attracted to the communion table where humanity meets the divine, right? We're attracted to divine love, agape love. We're attracted to a center. Evangelical, fundamental Christianity, conservative Catholicism, it's a castle with a wall around it, right? And you're either inside it or you're outside of it. Very different image for what's going on, for what the faith is about, right? And the castle has big, thick walls of dogma and, definitions of who's in and who's out, right? Progressive Christianity, it's a different animal. It's a different thing. That's like people say, well, what do you guys believe? What's your beliefs? Like as if Christianity was about beliefs, really. And my answer is like, well, it's not about, it's like, we're not hung up about beliefs really at all. We don't have a creed that you have to follow. We have Jesus, our pioneer of divine love. That's what we're attracted to. Come join us. We're not telling you where the walls are. We don't have walls. We have a communion table open to everybody. I think we're out of time, aren't we?
Well, pretty close. Do you mind sticking by for the rest of the people who want to ask question?
Please, I'm sticking.
Okay, great. When you're talking about the communion table, Adventists believe the communion is merely a symbol. I always think of Flannery O'Connor. Remember her response to when somebody said the communion is only a symbol, she said, well, it's only a symbol, to hell with it.
That's right. Man. Well,
or she was a very fairly conservative Roman Catholic. So,
well, you know what? That's a deep subject we could fill up a couple hours on.
Let's do that next time.
Exactly, but my short response to that is the project of Christianity today is to reclaim the reality of the sacraments, right?
Mm.
So, the Catholics said, oh, when you ring the bell in the Mass, the bread becomes the actual physical body of Jesus. Then the Protestants come along and say, no, it's just a symbol of the presence, right? And, Martin Luther got pretty exercised about that. He was defending the real presence, right? But now our job is to go back to not the belief that, you ring the bell and the wafer is Jesus. Now our project is to realize that we are in communion with the divine in everything, right? And that we find the real presence in each other and even in our enemies.
That's right. In
nature and in the natural world around us that we need to preserve and protect, and to find the sacred, the universe at a grain of sand in the palm of your hand.
That's right.
That's the kind of real presence we need to. I'm sorry, I'm on a tangent, but it's a big deal.
He is in the midst of them means he is in the people, really. Yeah, let me bring in my friend Andreas Bachmann. Andreas is one of our teachers here at ATSS from time to time, and he has an interesting setting. He works in Germany, where there are not many people who actually believe in much of anything Christian. But Andreas is part of the Adventist Church, and a very progressive and interesting part of it. Andreas, join the conversation here.
Well, thank you indeed. This is the German voice, a little bit lower than usual because I'm on COVID-19 currently. That's why the camera's off as well. So apologies for my voice. The question I had on mysticism, I think you answered brilliantly already, almost prophetically, just before I wanted to ask it with Richard Rohr, and added on it a little bit more just now when you talked about communion. But in terms of the current developments in the US, and might I add, in Germany as well, I'm very much into the confessing church and the Barmen Theological Declaration with its strong Christology.
Yes.
And as I might confess, kind of tongue in cheek, you need to know this as well to understand my question. I'm a graduate of Andrews University.
Yes.
I'm a graduate of Liberty University.
Oh, wow.
I'm a graduate of Loyola College in Maryland. So that gives you the mixture. So my question is really, would the confessing church be progressive in your definition? And if so, what can we learn? If not, what should we avoid? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would not impose on the confessing church and the Barmen Declaration and Bonhoeffer and that whole mix. I would not impose the terminology of progressive Christian on them, on
Yeah.
that, on your movement. I think that wouldn't make sense. Not that that there's anything oppositional about the two necessarily. I think you're looking at, the Barmen Declaration. There's the Barthian perspective about the faith. Um, would you say that's Karl Barth kind of suffuses that perspective, that Christology?
Well, Barth was one of the major authors of the Barmen Declaration, but yes, your answer is kind of showing something like, I might say, a third way, because fundamentalism obviously is a development earlier than Barmen. And we are now talking about progressive churches. And I'm just wondering whether there's something in between. And I stumbled across it in once again in your explanations about the importance of communion, which is you could offer that as a Christological answer. But then Christology is, of course, a very dogmatic thing if you want to see everything like Bonhoeffer. Everything is seen Christologically. So I was just wondering about that.
Well, I'm certain that it's hard for me to imagine any progressive church where somebody with uh, Barth's perspective on the Bible and Christology where it would be like shunned or like, oh, you're not one of. There's definitely room for that really important perspective in progressive Christian churches. It might not be what you hear preached from the pulpit, right? But it would certainly be a welcome contribution to the conversation in the congregation. So, yeah, I think there's respect for that. There's room for that, certainly. Um, but again, it's a dogmatic construction, and I don't think you'll find any progressive Christian, church that calls itself progressive that's going to impose that doctrinal expectation on its members, even though it's an important and interesting one. Yeah, progressive churches aren't going to say you got to believe this stuff to be with us. That won't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, the Barth's perspective on the scripture is it is a kind of a third way. It really is. So it's certainly part of the conversation. Thank you.
Could that be? Thank you very much for your answer. I think it's very, very thoughtful in many ways. It makes me think. Let me put it this way. And the issue here is, could that be part of the historic decline of the progressive churches not having a position any longer? And while Just to tease you a bit here.
No, that's a good one. That's a good one. Anybody here ever read the Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels? Yeah. Okay. That's a really useful book to understand early Christianity, not just about the Gnostic text, but early Christianity. Anyway, at the end of her book, she asks a great question. She asked this question and she didn't answer it. This book's about 30 years old, so it's been around for a while. Anyway, she asked the question, she says, if the Gnostics had prevailed, that is, if the Gnostics had survived the purging of them by the Catholic Church in the early centuries, if the Gnostics had survived and been dominant in their perspective at that time in early Christianity, would the church still exist? She asked that question. Because Gnosticism didn't have a fixed dogma. It was loose. It was fuzzy. It had fuzzy edges. It didn't have a strong authority system as the emerging Catholic Church did, right? It was pretty loose. And she just asked that question, and it's a darn good one. It's like, does a rigid theological structure of definable does that provide survival value for a religious perspective, a religious tradition? Is it possible for this idea of Christianity focused on a centering attraction as opposed to a structure? Is it possible for that way of relating to the faith to survive? Does it have you heard the joke about the Jehovah's Witness who converted to being a Unitarian, and then he went door to door for no particular reason?
Yeah.
So we get it, progressive Christians get accused of that all the time. It's like, hey, you're open to everybody. It's like, then you're nothing, Well, I don't, my argument is it doesn't have to be that way. It's like, actually, we do stand for something. We do have an identity. We are Christian. We're all about Jesus. The Bible matters to us. It's the language of our tradition, our faith. It's the language, not the rule book, but the language. English has survived for a long time while being a mess, right? Additions, subtractions to the language all the time. Christianity, the English language has survived because nobody's in charge. Go to France. The French are trying to manage their language. It's not working. New words, particularly English words, sink into it all the time, make people get upset. My argument is, let Christianity be a living language, right? A distinct language, but a living language that evolves, changes, makes room.
Our tradition is trying very hard to make a very rigid structure. They're working hard at that, and very disappointed that there are people like us who don't sign into that. One of the nice things about the Adventist system, the Adventist community, I should say, Jim, is that we have this long history. The community is small enough that we all know people. And one of them is the Jarnes family. Kristen, who's going to speak now, her grandfather was my pastor when I was a little kid.
That's so cool.
Her mom and dad were some of my best friends. Dad just passed away not long ago. And Kristen, I'm just, every time I see you, it makes me so happy.
That's so great.
Go ahead.
It's good. It's good to see you too. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. So boy, this conversation, I I love that picture of you, Lauren. That's very I'm not sure what. But, my I could take this conversation. We could make so many different sessions out of this conversation and just break it down more. So I grew up in the Adventist church with generations of, Lauren was saying, of church workers. My parents both worked at the church. I spent my early childhood at Andrews University, our theological seminary. where, you know, all of those issues in the 70s and early 80s were swirling around our dinner table conversations, and all of these students and scholars were my parents' friends. And then we moved to the General Conference, and I grew up, I feel like, in those buildings. We were there when it moved from Tacoma Park to Silver Spring. Those were my first jobs, where I would go when I was homesick from school when I was younger. So I just, and my husband's family too, church workers that moved all over, teaching, preaching. So I've been on this journey through the past few years of deconstructing, or I like to think of reorganizing my faith, and trying to figure out what to keep and what to give away. And I have tried a couple different churches. I've done lots of reading. I was following Rachel Held Evans back when she was just blogging for Christianity Today before she'd written any of her books, and have been very involved online in these deconstructing communities. And I thought it was interesting you mentioned that Mormon blog. I'll have to look that up, because I found a lot in common with a lot of the deconstructing Mormons or LDS people online. But anyway, I have kids. They are in our Adventist Academy, and where I live here, it's a big academy, or high school. They live at home, but they go down for the day. And it's actually quite a healthy environment and community that we have here. And I've realized I'm not ready to leave Adventism. And my kids don't want to. It's our family, it's our friends, it's our community. So anyway, I'm trying to kind of balance all of that out. But what I think is interesting about Adventism is that we talk about ourselves, we think of ourselves often as very intellectual. And that's kind of what I had growing up at the seminary. And so what's been so interesting in the last decade or two in Adventism is realizing that really the leaders of the church are not such believers in being intellectual as we claim with all of our educational institutions. When it comes down to it, they always throw out what our thinkers and theologians say, and hold up what the fundamentalists say. So I'm an English teacher. I'm more of a poet kind of person, very drawn to mysticism. But I am wondering, do people who have that more intellectual framework, and who are not maybe so drawn to kind of that contemplative experience, what do they find in your church and in progressivism? Can they, how does that work when they make that transfer? Because I'm just really not seeing much of a future in Adventism the way that it is now. I'd like to give my children a faith base, but we also have people who are into science and into that kind of thing. Are they able to connect with the progressive church leaning more contemplative?
I'm sorry, what was the last question you asked?
Just that idea, like, I'm more of a like metaphor and symbolism and contemplative poetry, all of that. I love it. I could do that every day. But I also have people like my husband, who's a software programmer. He's actually also very creative. But people who are more into, because Adventism has thought of itself as very intellectual, and we've had this creed, and we thought we could prove everything and all of that. What do people that come from that kind of a faith that has such a strong belief system, are they able to connect with a progressive faith structure? I guess is my question.
That's a good question, because Jim, I think you have heard also that fundamentalism was an effort to take an inerrant scripture and make us a very rational explanation of it. And I think that's where Adventism is.
So thank you on that, Lauren. That's really pivotal and important. The thing to remember about fundamentalism, which would include the SDA Church, it just does, right? The thing about it is that it's new. It's actually modern. Oddly enough, might not seem like it is, but before Wellhausen, before Thomas Hobbes, before the documentary hypothesis, in and throughout the history of Christianity, all the way back, um, people read the Bible. They had hardly any interest in reading the Bible literally, right? If you read the mystics of the church from the very beginning, this huge literature of Christian mysticism and contemplation, they didn't read the Bible literally. They thought the Bible was divine. It came from God, right? It's God's word for us, to us, but not to be read literally, to be read as symbolism, allegory, and that it's all spiritual, all has spiritual meaning, right? That you have to dig for, right? It's not obvious. There's zero interest in fundamentalism's idea of reading the plain meaning of the text. Why would you do that? That's boring. It's nowhere, right? So that's just generally how, Jesus read the Hebrew scriptures that way, allegorical, symbolical. If Jesus went to Southern Baptist Seminary today and interpreted the Hebrew scriptures the way he did, as we read it in the New Testament, they'd throw him out. They'd throw him out of Adventist Seminary, right? Because he was doing midrash, which is free-form interpretation of the scripture.
That's right.
Yeah. Making connections.
Being poetic, creative, like what you're into, poetry and literature.
Right. Oh, I'm so into that. But do people who are not into that, do they still, are they able to connect with your progressive church with that structure?
I think what happens is that people, a fair number of, this is the Church Alumni Association folks that I was talking about. They get all this dogma and structured religion that doesn't work for them anymore, and then they get involved in the West Star Institute and go to all of its workshops and retreats and events and speakers and bloggers and all that to get this, to go way into the historical, critical, analytical, academic, intellectual approach to the study of Christianity, of early Christianity. And that's rich up to a point. And the point that where you hit the wall is like, why am I looking at this stuff at all? Yeah.
Right.
It's like, and then you, at its best, being turned on, getting involved at learning about the details of early Christianity. At its best, what it does, it to you to the spirituality of early Christians, right? Begin to understand them. And that's really amazing and rich and a deeply spiritual thing in itself, right? But I would say a lot of the Church Alumni Association, a lot of the folks that are moving from structured dogma that doesn't work and go over to this intellectual, analytical approach, they miss out on the spirituality.
Right.
Out on the felt experience of the divine. And then they just drift away. They wind up leaving the whole shebang at some point. They burn out on all of it, so that the heart, the guts of it are the spiritual experience, the spiritual practice. And let that interpret the scripture and the tradition. That's what the mystics always did. Still do, So
Thank you, Chris.
Richness there. But, yeah.
Jim, so long here. Let me see if we can get in Art and Gerald before they finished. Art, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Just a few comments. I think the problem that so many fundamentalists have and people who belong to a specific denomination have with progressive Christianity is that they say, well, you tend to spiritualize everything, just kind of explain things away and pick and choose your cafeteria Christians. As I look around at the religious landscape, it appears to me pretty obvious that everybody, including the fundamentalists and the evangelicals, are cafeteria Christians. I don't know of any group that takes everything Jesus said at its face value. They don't. Or the stories in the Old Testament. They don't. They pick and choose. How many people in the Adventists are big on the book of Revelation, and they take some of the book of Revelation very literally and have formulated doctrines around it. They tend to skip over the part where I think it is that God is causing blood to flow up to the horses' bridles or the horses' bits for 200 miles. Now, that's a lovely metaphor, isn't it? Well, hardly. I mean, it's disgusting. And to even want to look at something like that and say, wow, there's a lot of truth that I can find in that. And maybe they'll skip that and say, but there's a lot of truth in the next verse. Well, I don't buy that. So I think everybody is a cafeteria Christian. I know, and to zoom in a little bit more on Jesus, I don't know many Christians who advocate that you should not save for your retirement. Jesus advocated that, as I recall, and not to worry about tomorrow, to give to everyone who asks of you, to loan to anyone who asks you. They don't teach that. As many of the people who are here, I went to 4 years of Adventist high school, had 3 of those at a boarding school, and one of the people who, as you can guess, looking at me, who's now older. Who was a year behind me in my sister's class, has told people that she doesn't have anything. She didn't save anything for retirement because she believed what she was told. Jesus was coming soon and would come back long before she ever got to retirement age. That's almost criminal. But I'll leave it at that. One last thought, and this will mean more to the people who are out there than to you, Jim, but I appreciate what you've had to say, is that recently the General Conference Executive Committee had their annual council, and I watched the sermon that was given by the president of the General Conference, and I tried to imagine in my mind's eye if Jesus were there and asked to give that address and to speak, if it would have even resembled in the smallest way what I heard him say. And my conclusion was absolutely not. Not in any way, shape, or form. No similarity, whatever. But thank you, Jim. I appreciate some of the directions you've given. And it offends some of us who, not offends some, it offends some people who we really like formulas. Just tell me what I have to do. Don't tell me I have to think, Jim. Don't tell me I have to reason out what the real meat of what Jesus was trying to tell us. Just give me a formula. Thanks, Jim.
Amen. On the cafeteria Christian thing, amen. I mean, when was the last sermon you heard on this passage? Psalm 137. O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. You don't hear sermons about that, right? Because everybody's a cafeteria Christian. No news at all. Jesus was a cafeteria Jew, right? Picked and chose passages and mashed them up. He did mashups, right? Midrashic mashups. It's awesome what he did. You know, the rabbinical tradition of interpretation is just fantastic. It's so rich. And for us to reclaim this, you know, this is the thing. People think, oh, you know, we weren't, you know, fundamentalists, like there's this guy at USC, one of the fundamentalist campus ministers, he says, we're first century Christians. And I go, oh, really? What do you believe? You know, when Jesus said, the eye is the lamp of the body, was that metaphorical or factual? Is the eye a lamp? Or was Jesus using a figure of speech? Oh, he said, oh, that's a figure of speech. And I go, but aren't you like believing in the Bible literally? He goes, but obviously that's a figure of speech. And I go, well, it's not obvious at all because everybody in first century Roman world believed that your eye was a lamp. It's called extramission. People believed that light came out of your eye, interacted with the light in the world, and came back so that you could see. Your eye was a lamp. I look carefully at your eyes, I see little glimmers, little shiny things. That's the light coming out of your eye. Everybody believed that. Jesus believed it, right? So I'm just saying to this guy, if you're a first century Christian, then you've got to believe that the eye is a lamp.
It's interesting, Jim, that most biblical literalists use grape juice for communion. Uh, Gerald, you've got the last word.
Well, I'm not sure that's good or bad, but I've been listening. I've been thinking. Jim, I enjoyed very much learning a bit about you last night. I listened to your talk about the donkey. That was cute. Thank you for that.
Sure.
But it occurs to me that what we're trying to create here is something that can take the place of the religion that we're uncomfortable with. And we'll call it progressive Christianity, the capital P.
Yeah.
Whatever happened to the reality that there's God, that Jesus acted, thought, and touched a lot like him? Any attempt to make that static and freeze it into a Tootsie Roll pop that you can put in your pocket was missing the entire point. Wasn't Jesus closer to the truth when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world, it's within you"? And that's progressive. The problem that occurs to me is that when my level of progression feels so far in advance of Art's that I get ticked off at his slowness of heart and demand that he be excluded from my club. Can't we all just get along and progress?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think part of what you're pointing to, as I hear it, is a real concern that I have and a lot of others in the, leadership at a national level of this movement. It's like we do not want our understanding of Christianity to get frozen and locked in and fossilized, right? We want it to be a living, evolving, progressing movement, really. So we have to be vigilant about that and make room always. Again, if we're about a communion table that's an attractive center, as opposed to a wall of dogma around the belief system, then we have got to be serious about welcoming people who have different points of view about all this stuff. We need to be welcoming of people who are still fundamentalist in their theology, welcoming of people of other religions, because other religions may be as true for others as ours is for us.
Yep.
We have to be welcoming to people who have many different perspectives on the faith, on what it's about, on their way of their method of interpretation, not just their interpretations, but their methods of interpretation. So that's the tricky line we got to walk, and it's a challenge. It's hard. Got to stay focused on the center and make
one thing I forgot to say was that it occurs to me that one of the cardinal sins of a capital P progressive religion is that they're so selfish that they demand that they be right and others be wrong.
Yeah.
We've got to give that away. Thank you.
And it's so hard to do, isn't it?
It is.
Because
I want to be right.
Well, and people, they think that's what Christianity is.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the God that I know doesn't demand that.
But that's the definition. So here's my parting words to y'all, my wonderful Adventist friends. And that is, consider all the ways that you can create new institutions, organizations, and expressions of your beautiful tradition that make sense for you now. and be bold about that, and do not be shy about that. Creating your own fellowship groups, even your own churches, if you want to call them that. Creating your own networks, your own expressions that make room for all these points of view. Be bold. Do not hesitate. And, take risks. Talk to youngsters who know how to work social media about how to create spaces for them. They know what to do. You can provide the wisdom and the experience and the deeper knowledge and spirituality. They can provide the ways to get that out there in their world and to just expand your reach.
I love it.
Be bold, organize, don't stop.